Garland Favorito is going to talk to us tonight about the impeachment process from a historical standpoint. I want to put the disclaimer out. Although he's a really nice guy, he's neither Democrat nor Republican. He's a constitutionalist, and he's very proud of it. So you're going to get the history and the process of what the impeachment process means in America and what the Constitution really means. So Garland, would you address this good group of guys?
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here. It's the first time I've ever been here. It's a great location, beautiful place. But I'm a little bit nervous because Michael has come and asked me to talk about the most divisive topic in America today in front of an audience in which I've never met before.
It won't be divisive.
So I'm a little bit nervous about that, but I guess I'll survive. I wanted to mention a few things. I guess I won't make. I'll probably make half of you mad before it's over, but maybe not. So what I'm going to try to do tonight, I'm going to try to cut out all of the talking points and all of the media hype and all of that, and just focus on the Constitution and how would you do an impeachment according to the Constitution. So we'll ask a few questions. As you know, both sides said we're following the Constitution, and yet they're telling us exactly the opposite thing. So both sides cannot be right. So the question that we want to answer is, which side, was it the House or the Senate, that was following the United States Constitution and principles? How does this impeachment inquiry differ from other historical precedents? We'll talk a little bit about that. And you've heard a lot about this whistleblower. I'm going to tell you who that whistleblower is in case you don't already know and what his background is. So normally I have a PowerPoint presentation. It's about an hour or so. Michael said just cut it down to half an hour and just give us a handout. So on your table there is a 2-page handout with all the slides I'm going to go over tonight. There's about 16 slides, 2 pages, 4 on each side. 2 times 4 is 8, plus 2 times 2 is 16.
And they're numbered, by the way.
Yes, and Rich pointed out something I didn't know, that they are numbered. Pages 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one's got 4 slides on it, so you can follow along. I'm going to try to just keep this short, and so we have lots of time for questions and answers. And I think with that, I'm going to jump into it. As Michael told you, I am an independent. I am in the Constitution Party of Georgia. So that means we run our own candidates. I did not vote for either President Trump or Hillary Clinton. We ran our own candidates. So I am reasonably, about as independent as you can possibly get on that. As I said, I was in the Constitution Party, so we do have literature back there, and our principle is to stick with the Constitution. The Constitution is our authoritative document. I also have a background in impeachment. I was involved in 2 impeachment movements, the impeachment of Bill Clinton and the impeachment effort with George W. Bush. So again, more bipartisan involvement there. In 1997, I wrote some impeachable offenses that I was concerned about, criminal activity in Arkansas and so on that the Clintons were involved in, and I believe that they had abused their power. I sent those on up to Congressman Barr, Larry Clayman, a few others, and nothing really came of that. What happened there was the Republicans turned that into more of a sex soap opera, and I became very concerned about it, and I wrote a book. It's called Our Nation Betrayed. And I contend that there was mutually assured destruction between the 2 parties to ensure that the next president, George W. Bush, would get elected. I forgot to bring the books tonight, walked out of the house because I was tied up all day, but there was a picture of the book. It's called Our Nation Betrayed, Mutually Assured Destruction, and it's now out of print, but you can still find it on Amazon, and I apologize I didn't bring some copies tonight. So moving on to 2004, I drafted some potential impeachable offenses regarding George W. Bush in became convinced that he invaded Iraq under pretenses that were proven to be false before the invasion. So I wrote some up, that was in 2004. I sent them off to Dennis Kucinich, met him once. He did not do anything with them until the House leadership changed from, in that case, from Republican to Democrat. So in 2007, he wrote HRS 1258, which was an impeachment articles for George W. Bush. If you really want to see some real impeachment articles, they were very, very serious. I think the most comprehensive articles that I've ever seen written, and he used a couple of the things that I suggested. Whether or not he got them from his own sources or mine, I can't tell you for sure. So that's my background as an independent and experienced in impeachment, so to try to give you some of my credentials to even speak about this. So going right into the history, just really quickly, I'm not a true historian, but I just want to give you a little bit of history about the impeachment, and you can follow this along, it's all on your slides. 15 judges have been impeached. 1 senator and a secretary of war, all since 1797. 8 judges have been convicted and removed by the Senate. It requires a 2/3 majority vote. 1 judge, Alcee Hastings, was impeached in 1989. He then ran for Congress and was elected in 1993.
Wow.
And he's been in Congress since 1993.
Wow.
27 years. And he in the House. If the president is impeached, the vice president would become president if he was impeached and convicted. So the election is not really overturned. That's kind of a talking point that really doesn't matter, because as we see in the Constitution, it doesn't really matter the timing so much if an impeachable offense has been committed. No president has ever been convicted or removed from office. Just a quick history of a couple of them. The first one was Andrew Johnson in a very, very divisive time just after the Civil War. And there was a huge argument about civil restoration, which is what he preferred, versus a military reconstruction effort, which is what we got. At that time, there was a lot of disregard for the Constitution by the United States Congress, and I have a whole other presentation of the constitutional violations that occurred during what we call the Civil War, which I tend to call it the war against the states. But in any case, the argument became Johnson wanted to remove the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. And the House said, no, you have to, you can't remove him because the Senate, because all the appointments have to be approved by us. So they had a constitutional battle going on about that. And the Senate and the House passed what we call the Tenure of Office Act, meaning that preventing Johnson from removing Edward Stanton, who was the Secretary of War during the Civil War. Johnson said, no, that is unconstitutional. He's in my cabinet, I can remove him if I want to. Johnson was eventually proven correct because the law was ruled unconstitutional in 1926. But he was impeached anyway, and that was in 1867, and he was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate, 35-19. Now remember, at that point in time, all of the seceded state has not come back into the Union yet, so that's why there was a reduced Senate there. So that's Andrew Johnson. It's amazing. That's an amazing story that you could go on for a long, long time on. 100 years later, we had Richard Nixon. He was not actually impeached. He resigned about 10 days after the judiciary passed 3 impeachment articles. The most important one probably was obstruction of justice for covering up the DNC the Watergate break-in. He was involved in that a cover-up. He didn't know about the break-in when it happened, the evidence showed, but he was involved in the cover-up. So that obstruction of justice is different than obstruction of Congress. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So he resigned rather than face impeachment. Rich and I were talking about this. Would he have been impeached? It was a close call. I think he would have. I think at that time it was about a 56 to 44 margin for the Democrats in the Senate, and they probably could have picked up 11 Republicans and impeached in a bipartisan manner. But it's still questionable. Moving on to 1998. The House impeached Bill Clinton for the charge of perjury. I was involved in this. I had determined that there was much more serious crimes, Madison Guarantee and death of Vince Foster, Rose Law Firm, lots of stuff going on in Arkansas that some of you are probably aware of. But it turned out to be, all of that was kind of covered up, and in that case, Republicans went forward against Starr's investigation and it turned out to be lying about a sexual affair, which was not really what initiated the impeachment movement. That was kind of a cover-up in itself. But Bill Clinton was acquitted in the Senate on perjury and obstruction. So that's the background of impeachment. So now let's kind of fast forward another, what we got, 40 years here, 20 years. And what does the Constitution actually say about impeachment? So most of you here know that. You've probably been watching the TV. The House has the sole power of impeachment. The Senate has the sole power to try the impeachment. So what does the Constitution actually say about impeachment? As many of you already know, the House shall have the sole power to impeach, and the Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. That's all based on the Article 1. The Senate can vote to convict the president on 2/3 majority vote. That's required. And all of that's defined in Article 1. So Article 2 gives us the criteria for impeachment. It says that a president, vice president, or all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and of conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. You've probably heard this many times before. So the question in regards to President Trump and the articles of impeachment, according to the Constitution, the question becomes, did President Trump use military aid or a White House meeting to get Ukrainian President Zelensky to investigate Joe or Hunter Biden for Trump's benefit in the 2020 election? That's the question that needs to be applied to the impeachment. That's the question that was posed in regards to the impeachment. All of this was triggered by a July 25th congratulatory call that President Trump had with Ukrainian President Zelensky. So let's apply what actually happened, the facts, to the law. We'll apply the facts of President Trump's events to the law of the United States Constitution. One criteria for impeachment was treason. As you know, that allegation has been made via the Mueller investigation, but Robert Mueller's investigation found no collusion between Trump and Russia. So there is really no treason there. Well, what about bribery? Trump, according to everybody's account, got nothing of value from Ukraine. I don't think there's anyone who disputes that. So Trump received nothing of value, therefore you cannot have bribery because, you know, bribery in federal law requires you to carry out the act. So since he got nothing of value, what about some kind of impeachable quid pro quo or something? We've heard a lot about that. Well, we know that in regards to the meeting, the Ukrainian President Zelensky received a meeting with the president at the United Nations in New York. So even though President Trump got nothing from Ukraine, President Zelensky did get a meeting.
In addition, Ukraine got all prospective aid from the U.S. that was approved 20 days before September 30th deadline. So the aid was actually approved on September 11th, and this is prospective aid. All aid is prospective, it is not current. So the aid for the future Ukrainian aid was approved 20 days before the deadline, September 30th. So Ukraine received all the aid that they were expected to receive. That eliminates any kind of impeachable offense for a quid pro quo. The next question would be, well, what about, wasn't there extortion of some kind? Well, we've heard that charge. There was no extortion on the call transcript, none whatsoever. The Ukrainians have said multiple times, including President Zelensky and Andrew Yarmak, that they were not under any pressure. They were unaware of the aid being having a delay in approval until a Politico article came into print about August 26 or 28, somewhere around that time frame, and they had had 5 meetings with the U.S. officials, and there was nothing on the call that would indicate, or any of those calls that would indicate that they knew anything about the any potential aid delay. So that basically eliminates extortion.
Pressure. Andrei Yermak also has said that, and the fact that Ukrainians were not really even aware that there was a temporary hold in place until a political article came out in August of 26, and they had met, but from the time of that call to the article 5 times and never raised the issue of the aid, so they were not even aware of it. So that eliminates extortion. So the Judiciary Committee has a little bit of a dilemma. So they concluded in the next slide that President Trump's action need not rise to the level of a criminal violation to justify impeachment. That is their exact quote. That conflicts with the Constitution. So what the new accusation after those had failed was, did President Trump participate in a corrupt scheme? So so the problem with that is that he asked for an investigation into 2 things: the potential 2016 Ukrainian interference, which may or may not be true, and he asked for an investigation as to why Joe Biden fired Viktor Shogun, the Ukrainian prosecutor, who was investigating Burisma, which was a known corrupt company that also had Joe's son Hunter on the board, and he was being paid millions of dollars. So the president asked President Zelensky to investigate that. The problem with that is that it is not a corrupt motive, because everyone in the United States of America would have a legitimate interest in knowing if there was corruption in that particular case. So you cannot say that it's a corrupt motive. You could say that maybe he had mixed motives, maybe it would have benefited him, but it's not an impeachable offense. It's not it has to be a true corrupt motive, which is not being questioned. So that's kind of Article 1, that's why they had no crime. They could not come up with a crime for Article 1. So moving on to Article 2, we had the same problem. Article 2 charges the president with obstruction of Congress. Now, obstruction of Congress is different than obstruction of justice. Obstruction of justice, in the case of Richard Nixon covering up the break-in, is a legitimate obstruction of justice. Obstruction of Congress, if you're going to charge it, there's no such thing, there's no such crime. So if the president is obstructing Congress, Congress has the obligation to resolve that dispute through the judicial branch. That's why we have 3 branches of government. If the judicial branch rules in Congress' favor and the president still ignores them, then they can charge obstruction of justice, because he would be obstructing justice. Obstruction of Congress is not a crime, and that's what that's where we are on that. So let's look at some of the things that the president was accused of on obstruction. So he basically did not reply to 24 subpoenas that were issued by the House. That's a fact. He did not reply to them. The reason is the House never issued, they never voted to start an impeachment effort. If we go back to the Constitution in the beginning, the House has the sole power to impeach. The Speaker of the House does not have the power to impeach. The House has the power to impeach. The Speaker of the House called a press conference and said, okay, I'm going to start an impeachment effort. She was supposed to have a vote first. She did not have that until a month later, after they had issued 24 subpoenas. So the President's Council kicked them back and said, hey, sorry, we're not going along with this because you haven't voted for impeachment. So that, according to the Constitution, that was the correct thing to do. Now, the next thing that comes along is the agency employees. They asked for certain agencies employees to testify, but the House refused to allow them to bring their agency counsels with them. And that's unprecedented. It's not a violation of the Constitution, but it's unprecedented. So the President's Council balked on that. It's something that would have to be resolved by the judicial branch. So the appropriate way to resolve that is for the House to take it to the judicial branch, as the way they did in the McGahn case, and that is still pending. The other thing that they wanted were the top aides to testify. The top aides have, in precedent, always been granted immunity, the actual top level that report directly to the President. That's a precedent that would have to be resolved by the judicial branch, so Congress can take that, the judicial branch can make a ruling, they can require the President's aide or employee to testify, and if the President refuses at that time, then that's a legitimate case for obstruction of justice. But it never went through the judicial, those two never went through the judicial branch, and the first one was unconstitutional. So we move on in applying the Constitution. How did the House apply the Constitution to due process? This is another interesting thing. So the President has a right, as I mentioned, for the judicial branch to make decisions on any privilege claims that he called. He never actually really claimed privilege. What he claimed was immunity. And failure to follow the process. But in the House violated their own due process rules. So the House has a rule that says that minority party gets to call witnesses in any hearing. And they normally have co-equal subpoena power. So the majority calls their witnesses, the minority gets to call certain, probably a smaller number of witnesses. But that never happened. The House leadership in the Judiciary Committee and the House Intelligence Committee refused to allow the minority to call any witnesses. In addition, so that alone violated 5th and 14th Amendment of the due process rights. In addition, they did not give the President the right to, in the hearing, to be present. President's Counsel could not be present in the House Intelligence Committee where all the fact witnesses were called. So he didn't get a chance to have anybody present to cross-examine the witnesses or to call in other witnesses. So essentially what you have there is violations of the 5th and 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. So moving on, the House voted to impeach, as you all know, and regardless of all that. And then we have the question, was the Senate impeachment a fair trial? Because this was, in fact, the first Senate impeachment in history with no witnesses. That's a fact. But the problem there is that the Senate has a responsibility under the Constitution to heartily reject unconstitutional impeachment articles. So we came out back in the Constitution Party in December and said, wait a minute, these articles are unconstitutional. The Senate has to reject them for the reasons that I've given you tonight. So whether or not there were witnesses doesn't determine the constitutionality of the impeachment articles. So anybody here a lawyer? So what we have here, what we had in the, you don't want to admit it though, right? So what we have in the Senate is the equivalent of what they call a summary judgment in a U.S. trial. If the prosecution comes forward with the case and they don't have all the prerequisites that it should have, the judge will issue a summary judgment for the defense. And that's essentially what this all amounted to. An unconstitutional article, Senate rejects in a summary judgment fashion without calling witnesses. Constitutionally, that was the correct thing to do. Now, to show you that I am not biased, I'm going to tell you how the president could have been impeached legitimately. He could have been impeached if the House voted to initiate an impeachment inquiry, which is what they did not do. They would have then assigned that to the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee has jurisdiction for impeachment, not the House Intelligence Committee, which was where Adam Schiff conducted all the hearings and stuff. The Judiciary Committee at that time should allow the President and the minority to participate, co-equal subpoenas, and they would participate equally. And then the Judiciary Committee can create articles of impeachment and vote on them. Now, the article of impeachment that they could have actually legitimately impeached President Trump on is bombing Syria without a declaration of war according to Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. That would have been a legitimate article to send to the Senate. The judiciary could have voted for it, the House could have voted for it, and the Senate could have had a full trial on that with witnesses. But that will never happen because, as you know from previous precedents, presidents are bombing countries and without constitutional approval and violating Article 1, Section 8. Obama violated the Constitution by bombing Libya. Clinton violated by bombing former Yugoslavia. And George W. Bush violated by invasion of Iraq under what I believe were clearly false pretenses. They never had any weapons of mass destruction, and I'm convinced that everyone in Washington knew it. So all of those violations of the Constitution have bipartisan support. So we got a real problem here, which I think is in that you've got bipartisan support for unconstitutional activity by the President of the United States. And that kind of gives you an idea of the corruption that is really up there. And notice that the news media is always in favor of us bombing some country, whatever it is. They contend that was the only thing the President did right. So so how did all this whole thing start? There was a gentleman, you'll see it in your slide, his name was Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. And he claimed that there was, during this call that the two presidents, Trump and Zelensky, that President Trump made a demand, quote, of President Zelensky in their July 25th call. No other witnesses said that there was a demand. None. The transcript didn't have a demand on it. And it turns out, if you watched all the House Intelligence Committees, that Vindman had a history of leaking, and 3 witnesses who testified had previously expressed concerns about Vindman's leaks. So Vindman leaked this call to a CIA analyst named Eric Ciaramella. And Eric Ciaramella was the one who filed the original complaint. Eric Ciaramella was a CIA analyst. The complaint was 100% hearsay evidence. There was not one single direct evidence fact in the complaint that supported it. And in fact, there's hardly been any direct evidence fact of any crime throughout this entire ordeal, which has cost millions of taxpayer dollars and months of time. So Ciaramella, as you can see from your pictures, you'll see his picture in there on the slides. He worked in the White House, Obama White House, with Joe Biden, and he also worked on Ukraine matters. And he was invited, in fact, to a White House lunch by Joe Biden with Italian diplomats, because he is Italian. The other, you'll see down there, he has a picture of him with John Brennan, former CIA director. But the other interesting thing about him is Ciaramella had contacts with a lady named Alexandra Chalupa. Alexandra Chalupa was a Ukrainian American who initiated the Trump-Russia collusion claims. And you'll be hearing more about that in the next year. It's going to be a hot topic in the elections coming up, I believe. So my conclusion is that, and feel free to disagree with me, but the House abused its power by usurping the judicial branch authority and not routing those precedence claims and immunity claims to the judicial branch, U.S. Supreme Court or Federal Court, for a resolution. They abused their power, and then they falsely impeached the president on articles that are not correct. And that, in fact, interfered with the 2020 election by attempting to remove the president before the election. So ironically, what I found about this whole thing is that the House did exactly what they accused the president of doing. Only in America can you be accused of, only in Washington, D.C. can you be accused of corruption when you're trying to investigate corruption. So, but I want to leave you with the last thought before we open up for questions. This is really not about Trump or an impeachment or one issue. The underlying motive of all this is whether or not we're going to be a republic or a democracy. A democracy is majority rule regardless of law. A republic has a certain amount of rules regardless of the majority that's in power. And that is what the real fight is about today. Are we going to be a republic or are we going to be a democracy? So I'm urging everyone here to make that decision and become active. If you believe that you want a democracy, you have to fight for it. If you believe that America should be a republic as it was founded, please fight with us on that one, because that's what we believe. With that, I'm opening it up to questions, and we see a bunch of them.
Gracious. Let's go dead center first. Al in the back.
All right, Garland, thank you so much for that. You laid out the case point by point, very organized, very rational. Why didn't the president's attorneys just lay this out and be done with it?
Or call you.
We sent our article to the president's attorneys. I sent it personally to Pat Cipollone and said, look, what we're concerned about is that neither party really follows the Constitution the way it should be, and which is why we have a party that exists. So it's not just a one-sided thing. It's a great question, but neither party adheres to the principles of the Constitution. The clear, plain text is undisputable. So it's not a one-sided thing. It's both parties.
Well, if it benefited them to do so, it seems like they would, or are you just afraid they would have their feet held to that same fire in the future?
You know, that's a great question, Alan, and it's hard to judge people's motives. They did lay out the unconstitutionality of Article 1 pretty well, but they did not lay out the unconstitutionality of Article 2 very well. I don't know. Sometimes they tend to go with precedent arguments and emotional arguments and subjective arguments over the Constitution, and we always say, let's follow the Constitution, and regardless of what the precedents are, or the emotional arguments are.
Let's go to Gary.
We have the majority of people, congressmen and senators that speak on television that'll call this a democracy. They do that over and over, 99% of the time.
Yes, thank you. And
Change the language.
And that is why we're so, this is what the real battle is. The real battle is, what we're fighting for here, is a republic. That's what the founders envisioned, that's what they set up. The Constitution is the rule of law, regardless of who's in power. You know, if it was the other way around, Republicans have to do the same thing. You know?
Well,
The best example I've seen of democracy versus republic on a very granular level is if there were 4 women and 6 men in a room and they voted to rape women, a democracy say, go for it. A republic says, wait a minute, there's a law that says this is immoral,
Exactly.
illegal, unconstitutional, you shall not.
Exactly. And this is exactly what happened. The Constitution was ignored.
Jim?
Is there any grounds to impeach Nancy Pelosi for abuse of power?
The first thing that would have to happen is there would have to be a change in power in 2020. If there is a change in power, I don't know that Nancy Pelosi is going to last that much longer anyway.
Yeah.
But Adam Schiff would be one. If you remember, Adam Schiff stood up in the House Intelligence Committee, and he completely fabricated a version of the transcript.
Over and over.
That's over and over.
Mr. Wood?
This is a little different angle. It seems to me that when I look at what's happening in India, what's happening with Brexit, what's happening in the Philippines, a kind of an aggressive form of nationalism and money and power is kind of percolating. And it seems like it's not just here, it's other places too. Does that make any sense to you?
Well, I'm not really qualified to speak on that. They say that you're really smart if you know what you don't know. So I think I'm going to take a pass on that one. It's a good question, but I'm really not.
Gary, Mr. Perdiz?
I got 2 questions, but the first one's real quick, one sentence. Basically, you said that there were no witnesses called in this, and that was unprecedented.
Right.
And then you explained why, which I happen to agree. But here's the question that seems to be ignored, and I think I'm correct. Is it not true that in all other impeachment efforts that made it to the Senate, the witnesses that were called had already been called in the House, had been under oath, and they were just witnesses coming back and stating, I don't believe they ever called a new witness that was never in the House before.
Great question. I double-checked that, and there were new witnesses called in the Senate.
In the past?
Yes, in the
Okay.
past, in the Clinton impeachment and some of the judges as well, and Andrew Johnson.
And one other question real quick. I had never heard the term obstruction of Congress until this. Is that a newly created concept, or has that been around?
They accused Richard Nixon of obstruction of Congress,
Okay.
but they accused him of legitimate crimes. They accused him of obstruction of justice, and that was the main one. That was really the main impeachable offense, and then obstruction, abuse of power, and then obstruction of Congress but they never went that far with it.
Mr. Casanova?
Three quick rapid fire questions here. First, what you stated is the House violating their own due process according to the 5th and the 14th Amendment. Is there a possibility based on that could be overturned? I mean, is there grounds to overturn because they didn't follow the constitutional,
Overturn the impeachment?
the impeachment? I mean, it's never been done before, but is there grounds?
If the House changes in July, or when it was November, excuse me.
January.
Yeah, it'll be January. Around. Anything is possible.
Is there a statute of limitations, whatever?
I suspect they'll go back and they'll try something.
And then the other question was the timeline. I mean, I heard some commentators say that it was basically a 45-day process. I mean, is that unusual, right? Normally it's a number of years. With Clinton, it went on forever.
Yeah, it's fast, but there's not a constitutional violation there. It can be
Okay.
quick, fast, or slow.
And then the last question, for your party, is there a candidate that is holding office at any level, for the constitutional party? And if so, what's the highest level?
Yeah, we have a few candidates, that's a chairman question. We have a few candidates in office in different states, but they're mostly like county level.
Representatives, so there's no federal, no
not
federal office?
Not in the U.S. Congress.
Woody?
Oh, I got a couple observations and one question. First, the Senate used to be chosen by the states to represent the states. They changed that.
Yes.
Bush, when they passed the tax, and Obama, when he passed his Health Care Act, they kind of were depending on the Supreme Court to behave one way, uphold it as not a tax, but the Supreme Court went against the current popular thinking. So I think that we should not blindly put a lot of faith in the Supreme Court to do what maybe the majority would want, and then we'd really be stuck. So my observation is, or my question is for you, what can we do to stop the whittling away of little by little each of the rights in the Constitution? I just don't know. I think it frustrates a lot of my friends, and that's why that attitude is kind of c'est la vie. We're beyond help.
Yeah, I want to, you made such an important point, I don't want it to be lost before the crowd goes. What he said was in the seventh, I forget which amendment it was, 13th Amendment, I believe. No, I'm sorry, it's not the right number. The senators in America have always been appointed by the states. However, the Constitution was amended around 1913 to make the senators directly elected. That was a huge mistake because it removed any accountability of the federal government to the states. And that's not the way that America was set up. America was set up is that the federal government was subordinate to the states, and we, the people, were above the states. So that basically reversed the whole hierarchy in America, and I didn't want that point to be lost.
Well, that was done to implement the income tax, by the way,
At the same time in the Federal Reserve.
Lots of smart folks. Myron, last question. Short
I just got a quick question, just for me. I wanted, where do you find out how much of the American citizens' money have been spent on all of this stuff?
Clock's still running.
Yeah, it's the Mueller investigation alone, I think, was about $32 million.
Jeez.
This one is probably going to run it's probably run at least half that, if not more. So we're looking at $50 million thrown down.
But what is that based on? Like the time of senators or whatever? I mean, or
50 million.
Yeah, time.
lawyer fees, but who's paying the lawyer fees?
All right, and we don't.
You are.
Yeah,
We are.
Okay.
All right, I'm sorry, we need, if you want to visit with,
Thank you.
Whistleblower, you said you were gonna
Yeah.
tell.
Yeah, that's Eric Chiarinello.
Yeah, he did.
That was.
send your notes.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Eric
he did.
Chiarinello. In your notes.
Why was he never brought to the media, or why was he never brought to the media?
Answer quickly.
Did he get let go after they acquitted him?
I'm sorry, who that guy?
Once Trump got acquitted, did Eric get let go from the CIA?
As far as I know, he's still there.
So I read something that said Trump had.
But Vindman's gone. Vindman's gone.
Well, they're gone from the White House. They're both gone from the White House, but they're still on the CIA and NSC payroll.
Vindman is?
So Eric
Yeah.
was in the White House and the CIA.
Right, because the CIA has an analyst in the White House, and the NSC has an analyst in the White House, multiple analysts.
All right. Very important thing. Let's give it a You're doing the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So rise up.